The first Father's Day was in Spokane, Washington on June 19th, 1910. It was not until 1924, though, that President Calvin Coolidge proclaimed the third Sunday in June as the day that we're going to give honor to fathers. From a scriptural standpoint, giving honor to parents, and that would certainly be inclusive of fathers, is a scriptural and a right thing to do. In the Ten Commandments that God gave to Israel, as recorded in Exodus 20 and verse 12, he says to honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. At the second giving of the law, thus Deuteronomy, in chapter 5 and verse 16, Moses again emphasizes this principle. Honor thy father and thy mother, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee, that thy days may be prolonged, and it may go well with thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Now there's a promise that is connected with that, honoring your parents. And so as Paul reflects back to this, no doubt, would write in Ephesians 6 and verse 2, honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with promise. And so there is a promise that is attached to that, honoring your father and your mother. When the Pharisees, by their tradition, set aside this command, God or Christ condemned them. Matthew the 13th chapter. When they have challenged Jesus about his apostles transgressing the tradition of the elders, he turned it around on them and asked them, why do you transgress the commandments of God by your tradition? For God commanded, saying, honor thy father and thy mother, and he that curseth father and mother, let him die the death. But ye say, whosoever shall say to his father and his mother, it is a gift by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, and honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free. Thus ye have made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. Ye hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And thus there is a specific condemnation, because these Pharisees set aside that command of God to honor thy father and thy mother. And they were not doing so. And so he says, while you claim with your lips to honor me and to draw near to me, in reality you're not. Your heart's far from me. Your worship, and we see in the next verse, verse 9, is vain. It's worthless. Earlier, he has said that they are transgressing the commandments of God. And so it's a serious thing to fail to do that which God says. And that would include honoring our parents. In this day, since this is set aside since 1924 to honor fathers, I want us to just look at fathers for a little while this morning. And when we look at fathers within the home, the father is, of course, to be the head of the home. He has that first by right of creation. When God created this world, created everything, and then finally, as the crowning point of that creation, He created Adam. And in that creation of Adam, He then realized that it's not good for Adam to be alone, and so He made for Adam a helpmeet. But by right of creation, in the order of that creation, the man has, or the husband has, that right of authority as being the head of the home. In 1 Corinthians 11th chapter, Paul calls upon this in verse 2 when he says, "But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God." And so he sets an order of authority. You have God, you have Christ, you have man, and then you have woman. By the way, we'll add here, that's not an order of inferiority in which Christ is inferior to God, or where the woman is inferior to man. It's not a matter of inferiority, it is a matter of authority. And thus, or as it's used here, headship. Paul calls upon this same principle in 1 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, when he says that the woman is to learn in silence, not to exercise authority over the man. And he gives a reason, one of those reasons, verse 13, "For Adam was first formed, then Eve." And so he goes back to creation, eternal principle here, that here Adam was first formed, then Eve, and because of that, the woman is not to exercise authority over the man, but to learn in silence. Thus, by right of creation, God has set forth an order of headship, of authority, in which the man has authority over the woman. And within the home, the husband has authority over the wife. But there's also, by right of the fact that the woman was deceived and not the man. In Genesis, the 3rd chapter, well, when God placed Adam and Eve in that garden, He told them they could eat of all of the trees and all of the things of the garden, except that tree that was in the midst of the garden, which was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And He told them, "The day that ye eat thereof, ye shall surely die." Satan comes along and tempts Eve in the first 6 verses of chapter 3. And so, as a result of that temptation, there's Eve partaking of that tree that God said don't eat of. Verse 6, "The woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree that was desired to make one wise. She took of the fruit thereof, and it did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat." The woman was deceived, the man was not. Apparently he entered into that with his eyes wide open, we might say. But the woman was deceived about it. When God comes, and as the indication is, it was a habitual practice for God to come and to fellowship with Adam and Eve and walk with them in the cool of the evening. And they've hid themselves from God because of their sin. And so God begins cursing first Satan. And then in verse 16, it says, "Unto the woman He said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. We now see a second reason that the man has authority within the home. Because of sin, because Eve was deceived, not Adam. Paul again calls upon this in 1 Timothy, the 2nd chapter. While in verse 13, that first reason, Adam was first formed, then Eve. Then verse 14, Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Thus, Adam was to have authority over Eve. The husband within that home is that one who has dominion, who has authority, or who has the rule within the home. If you look at any organization thus, you can look at any organization upon earth. It's going to have some type of rule, some type of authority or chain of authority, someone within that organization, or it might be a group within that organization, to exercise dominion within that organization. Otherwise, it simply cannot function as an organization. It's going to be a matter of chaos within the organization. Well, the home is the same way. There has to be some type of organization within the home. And God has established that organization within the home as being the man, being the head, being that one who rules, who has dominion, and the woman being in subjection to her husband. Again, that does not make and is not a matter of superiority or inferiority, that the man is somehow superior to the woman. In many respects, the woman is superior to the man. But as far as rule, as far as headship, the man is that one who is to be in control. He's the head of the home. Now, that does not mean that the man acts as some type of a cruel dictator in which he sets forth his edicts as with an iron fist, and you'd better toe the line or else. No, it's not that type of a headship or leadership. The home is going to operate properly when you have a man who loves his family. A loving man. And that means when we're talking about a loving man, we're talking about someone who loves God, who loves his wife, who loves his children. And so you have a loving man and all that that embraces, guiding his home, and a loving family then who delights in that leadership role of the husband, of the man of the home. In Ephesians 5th chapter, Paul is really discussing Christ and the church, as we see in verse 33. But he's going to use as an illustration of Christ and the church the husband-wife relationship. And so as we go back to Ephesians 5 and verse 25, he says to the husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. And so you look at Christ and the church in relationship to what the husband is to be in relationship to the home. Even as Christ loved the church, husbands are to love their wives. Now, that love that Christ had for the church extended and was so great that he gave himself for it. So likewise, husbands are going to love their wives to such an extent that they are willing to give themselves for the wife. He goes on, verse 28 and 29. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hateth his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. And so he continues to go back to that relationship of here's Christ in the church, because that's his real discussion, again, verse 33. But the husband-wife relationship is to be likened to that. And so, there in verse 25, love your wives. Verse 28, love your wives, even as your own body. And as you would not hate your own flesh, but instead you're going to nourish and cherish the flesh, so you do the same in relationship to your wife. You love the wife, you nourish and cherish the wife, even as he says, the Lord, the church. There's that loving, caring relationship of a husband ruling the home, yes, but doing so out of love and care and concern, nourishing, cherishing the wife and the home, even as he would his own body. In Genesis, the 18th chapter, that one who is referred to as the father of the faithful, Abraham, is commended by God in chapter 18 and verse 19 of Genesis, when he says, "For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him." Here's Abraham, his children, his whole household, which embraced more than just his children and his wife. It embraced other individuals. And he says, Abraham is one who is going to command his children and his household. He's going to make sure in leading them that they're going to do justice and judgment, that they're going to keep the Lord's way. He's going to be leading them in that which is right and good and holy. But he's going to command them in that as he leads them. There's the leading, but there's also that commanding his children and his household, that they're going to keep the way of the Lord. That's that loving type of relationship that Paul expresses there in Ephesians 5th chapter. A man who loves, who cherishes, who nourishes his family. Abraham is a beautiful example of that. And yes, because of his faith and his actions within that faith, or in his obedient faith, he's referred to as the father of the faithful. Should we not use him as an example of faithfulness in relationship to the family? In 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, as Peter turns it around and discusses the wife and her relationship to the husband, he uses Sarah as an example. In 1 Peter 3 and verse 6, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughter ye are, as long as you do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. This is not an attitude that the husband expresses, you better call me Lord or else. that wasn't the attitude of Abraham, or that which you see in relationship to Abraham. But out of respect that Sarah had for Abraham, she called him Lord. Now then, Lord, within the context that it's used here, we might use the term sir, or something along that line. It's not as we would think of Lord, Master, or a kingship. It's not that type of an attitude, but it is an attitude of respect that she had for her husband. And if you go back to Ephesians, the 5th chapter, Paul tells the wife that she is to make sure that she reverences her husband. God knows what men need and knows what women need. Within the context of Ephesians 5, he never tells the woman to love her husband. Now he tells the husband, you love your wife, and he says so repeatedly, but he doesn't, within that context, tell the wife to love her husband. Now, just to get the other side of that, in Titus, the 2nd chapter, he does. Within Ephesians 5, in this long discussion, he doesn't say that. He says, husbands, love your wives, but then he comes back in relationship to what the husband needs, because God knows that the wife needs that loving care and concern. But he also knows the nature of man and what man needs, and so he tells the wife, you see that you reverence your husband. That's what we see with Sarah. A woman who reverences her husband. And notice, whose daughters ye are. Those who are faithful Christians are going to be following in that footsteps of Sarah in relationship to the husband-wife relationship. She recognizes that loving, caring leadership of her husband. But also, within the home, the father is to train his children. The Scriptures give this charge specifically to the fathers. Ephesians 6 and verse 4, ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. There is an admonition given specifically now to ye fathers, not parents in general, but the father, because he is the head of the home, has that responsibility to teach and to train his children. That's what you again see with Abraham in Genesis 18 and verse 19. That I know Abraham. God says he's going to command his children. He's going to do it. He's not going to try and pass it off to Sarah, but he is going to command his children and his household after him. He was given that responsibility, that obligation to train the children. In Proverbs 18 and verse 19, the wise man says, chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not thy soul spare for his crying. So in that training, the father is going to be chastening his children, correcting them, disciplining them. And that is corrective discipline and corrective discipline. Training and correcting. There's both aspects of chastening embraced within that word chastening. Training them in the way in which they're supposed to go. That's what what God says, I know Abraham, he's going to command his children. There's that training that's involved. But there's also that chastening from the standpoint of a corrective discipline. When they go astray, you correct them. And knowing children, That's going to be different with every child. Some children you can correct them by just looking at them. Others, you look at them and that doesn't mean a thing to them. And you can threaten them and it's not going to mean anything to them. You take a rod of reproof and correct them. Why? Because children are different. They have different personalities. And a father within the home has to recognize that, and he has to teach them, but then correct them in the necessary ways. In Proverbs 22 and verse 6, it says to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. There's that need to train the child. Far too often, we try and pass that responsibility off, though. But we do not find God charging the mothers expressly as he does the fathers in this area. You can read through the scripture, and it simply is not there. There's not that charge to mothers, you train a child in the way that they should go. It's given to the fathers, not the mothers. Now then, we will add that certainly the mothers have a major influence in their children's raising. There's no doubt about that. You see this in 2 Timothy 1, and specifically verse 5, as Paul is talking about Timothy and his faith. He says, I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith which is in thee, which dwelt first in thy grandmother Lois and in thy mother Eunice. And I am persuaded in thee also. Now why did Timothy have that faith? Because of his faithful mother and grandmother. And because of their influence within his life, he had faith. And thus, there's no doubt that the mother plays a major role in the influence of the children. But while she plays that major influence within the children's raising, yet the responsibility still resides with the father. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Not mothers. And yet, far too often, we see man passing off that responsibility to someone else. And specifically to the wife. We have a problem within our society today of, it's given the term, the absent father. And you have these men going around fathering children all over the place, and yet they leave the home and you have the mother who has to raise them. That's wrong. It leads to the destruction of the home, which leads to the destruction of our society and our country. And that's what you're seeing within our society taking place today. These children now, having been fathered by someone and he's gone, he's no longer in the picture, and the mother having to try and take care of the family, go out and work and not have any influence on her children now. Thus the children just run wild in the streets. And they then start associating with gangs. Why? Because they're striving for attention so many times. And the attention that they receive from the gang is going to be such that it's going to negatively influence their wife, but it's because they're not getting the influence at home that they need. And that's because the father has departed the scene. He has tried to slough off his responsibility that God gave him in the raising of those children to someone else. And generally it's to the wife. But God still requires the father to take that role. The father is the one given that responsibility and that obligation. And no one can pass that responsibility off. You cannot pass that responsibility off to the wife. A husband cannot pass that responsibility off to the church. And that's what we see within the Lord's church many times. It's the church's responsibility to train our children. And if our children go astray when they get older, whose fault is it? Well, it's the church's fault. That's who it is. No, it's not. You see, they tried to pass the responsibility off to the church, but God gives the responsibility to the Father, not to the church. The church has the exact same responsibility and obligation in relationship to the children as they do to those who are adults and members of the church. And the same responsibility that it has to every person in the world, and that is to teach them the gospel. But as far as the training and the teaching of that child, it's not the church's responsibility. It's not the Bible class responsibility. It's not the elder's responsibility. It's the father's responsibility. The father specifically. And yes, the mother, as she helps in that taking care of the children. Within our society today, we see that responsibility trying to be passed off to the government. And the government being a willing participant in trying to take over the responsibility of parents. Have you ever heard the phrase, "It takes a village"? That became so popular by one of the presidents of years gone by. What did he mean by that? And what did his wife mean by that? Very simply, you can't do it yourself. It's not your responsibility. Let the government take over the raising of your children and the training of your children. And so many parents just sat back and said, fine, we'll let the government do it. Or let the schools do it. When we send our children to school, it's not really the school's responsibility to teach our children. It's our responsibility. Now, I can use the school as a tool, but the responsibility is still mine as a father, not the school's. The responsibility of the family lies with the father. Yet we also know that as children grow up, they make their own choices. We cannot make choices for them. And thus, as they make those choices, many times they will make the wrong choice. And they are responsible for those choices. I can't, within my life, look back and say, my father is responsible for the sin that I committed here. No, it's the choice that I made. I'm responsible for those choices. My father had the responsibility and the obligation to teach and to train me, but he is not responsible for the choices that I make. And that's what Ezekiel, the 18th chapter, teaches us. And specifically verse 4 and verse 18, or verse 20, that the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. And so, yes, while a father might teach and train his child in the way in which he should go, teach and train that child in the way of righteousness, the child might make the decisions within his life that he doesn't follow that way. I think a great illustration of that teaches us that lesson, even though sometimes it's hard for us to accept, on a personal level, do we blame God because the children of Israel, the children of God, went astray? They went after other gods. They committed whoredoms in the land, as Hosea accused them of doing. Was it God's fault that the children of Israel went astray? Well, no one would blame God in that situation. And yet we turn around many times, and within the home, we say, well, it's the father's fault or it's the parent's fault that the child went astray. No, not necessarily. Now, the parent might be responsible and might be blamed for lack of teaching and training within the home, but the child is still responsible for their own choices. The greatest way to train a child, though, is to be the proper example to them. You know, you cannot tell a child, don't smoke when you got a cigarette hanging out your mouth. You can't tell them, don't drink as you're pouring your wine into your glass. Don't take drugs as you pop a bunch of pills in your mouth. Consistency within the home and within the life of a father goes a long way in teaching the child. I think it's important for you to go to worship services, but I'm going to stay at home because this is the only day that I have to rest and I want to enjoy my day off. Or I want to go out on the lake fishing, or I want to go to the golf course and play golf, a round of golf. And so y'all need to go to worship, yes, but I'm going to stay at home. Or I'm going to go out working so that I can get a little bit more money for us. But it's important for you to go to worship services. No, you've taught them a lesson that it's not important by the life that you live. To train your children, you have to go before them, leading them, not just telling them. Be that proper example to a family of what a Christian is to be in every aspect of your life. That's the greatest way to train a child, because a child will immediately see the inconsistencies of our life and certainly point to those inconsistencies. The way for children to honor their parents, whether it be father or mother, is to obey them. Again, Solomon would write in Proverbs 23 and verse 22, "Hearken unto thy father that begat thee, and despise not thy mother when she is old." The idea of hearken there isn't just hear their words, but upon hearing their words, do them. Listen to them and act upon it. And thus Paul would say, Ephesians 6:1, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." Or to the Colossians, he would write in chapter 3 and verse 20, "Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord." That's what God expects. Children to obey their parents. That's one of the ways in which you honor your parents. We honor God when we obey Him, though. Out of respect and reverence for who He is, we come to be obedient to His will. In becoming a Christian, to obey that gospel of Jesus Christ, and then to live in faithfulness to Him. So if this morning you have not lived the type of life that God wants you to live, we would encourage you to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, or to come back to faithfulness to Him if you are a Christian who has gone astray within your life. So if we can help you in this, we bid you come as we stand and sing the invitation song.